My name is Tobina Okafor. I am 28 years old. And I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened at that bank, before I tell you about the woman behind the desk and the folder she opened, and the specific way the world cracked open and showed me something true that I had been living next to my entire life without seeing clearly. I need you to understand what it feels like to discover that the people who are supposed to be your foundation have been quietly, systematically, with the particular confidence of people who believe that love grants permission, using you. Not using you the way people use each other in the ordinary friction of close relationships, using you the way you use a tool. Using your name, your credit, your financial identity, the invisible infrastructure of your adult life that you have spent years building carefully, brick by brick, the way a person builds something when they know that no one will build it for them. I found out on a Tuesday morning in October when I was sitting at my desk at the architecture firm where I work as a junior associate, eating a granola bar and reading a project brief, and my phone buzzed with a credit alert from my monitoring service. Not an unusual thing. I have credit monitoring because I was taught by my undergraduate finance professor that credit is the financial equivalent of a reputation and that you protect reputations by watching them. The alert said, "New account opened in your name. Lender, First Meridian Bank. Amount, $47,000. I had not opened an account at First Meridian Bank. I had not applied for a loan of $47,000. I had not been in any bank branch or on any bank website in the previous 3 weeks, during which time I had been doing nothing more financially unusual than paying my rent and buying groceries and covering the cost of a birthday dinner for my friend Ezin, which had come to $63, and which I considered a reasonable expenditure. I put down the granola bar. I looked at the alert for a long time, the specific length of time a person looks at something when the information on it is clear and they are hopping through sustained looking to make it become different. It did not become different. I picked up my phone and I called First Meridian Bank. But I cannot give you the bank without giving you the before. Nothing makes sense without the before, and the before is the part that took me 28 years to fully understand, so I am going to give it to you as honestly as I know how. I grew up in Houston, Texas, in a house on Willow Bend Boulevard that my parents, Chukwudi and Adana Okafor, had bought in 2001, 3 years after they came from Enugu in southeastern Nigeria, 4 years before I was born. The house was a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that was solidly middle class in the way of Houston middle-class neighborhoods, which is to say it had good schools and functional sidewalks and a homeowners association that took its job seriously and neighbors who waved from driveways. My parents were, by any external measure, successful. My father had a civil engineering degree from the University of Nigeria Nsukka and had, after several years navigating the particular obstacle course of credential recognition that Nigerian immigrant professionals face in America, built a career at a mid-sized construction management firm in Houston where he was, by the time I was a teenager, a project manager of reasonable seniority. My mother had a background in accounting, had worked in various capacities over the years, bookkeeper at a small business, tax preparer during the season, accounts receivable at a medical practice, and was, when this story begins, managing the books part-time for 3 small Nigerian-owned businesses in the Houston area. They were respected in the community. This matters. In the specific community of Nigerian immigrants in Houston, the church community, the cultural association, the social network that both sustained and surveilled everyone in it, my parents were known as people who had built something. My father was the person other people called when they needed advice about construction contracts. My mother was the person other people brought their financial questions to, which is an irony so sharp it could cut glass, given what I am about to tell you. I was the only child for 6 years. Then my sister Ajora was born, and then my brother Chindam 3 years after her. The family grew, and the house stayed the same size, and the financial pressure that comes from a growing family in a middle-class American life began to accumulate in ways that I was, as the eldest, most aware of even when I was too young to understand the mechanisms. I was a good student. This is relevant not as a boast but as a fact about what it produced. I got a full scholarship to Rice University in Houston, which meant that my undergraduate education cost my parents almost nothing, which meant that the money they might have spent on my education was available for other things. I have thought about this since, in the specific retrospective way of someone who is trying to understand the full architecture of a situation. The scholarship was supposed to be a gift, to them, to me, to our collective future. It may have also been an opportunity that was used in ways I did not know about. At Rice, I studied architecture. I chose it because I had grown up watching my father read blueprints at the kitchen table, tracing the lines of buildings that would be built in Houston from plans that existed first on paper, and I had understood from a young age that there was something profound and satisfying about the act of designing the spaces where people live their lives. I chose it also because of a teacher named Mr. Celestine Ibarra, a Nigerian-American man who taught AP art at my high school and who, in my junior year, took one look at the portfolio I had assembled mostly for my own interest and said, "This is what you are. Do this." He said it with the authority of someone who has seen enough talent to recognize the real thing, and I believed him, and I went and did it. I graduated from Rice in 4.5 years with honors and a thesis project, a design for a community health clinic in underserved Houston neighborhoods, that won a regional award and that I am still, quietly, proud of. I got a job at a small but respected architecture firm called Pellard and Associates. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Montrose. I began the slow, careful work of building an adult life. Part of building an adult life is building credit. I understood this at 22 with the clarity of someone who had studied enough economics at Rice to know that the American financial system runs on the infrastructure of credit history, that your score is not just a number but a record of your reliability, and that reliability is worth protecting. I got one credit card. I used it for ordinary expenses and paid it off every month. I opened a savings account and made regular deposits. I financed a used car, a 2018 Honda Civic, dark blue, 47,000 miles on it when I bought it, perfectly functional with a small auto loan that I paid off 2 years ahead of schedule, because paying loans off early is how you prove to the system that you can be trusted with larger amounts. By 28, my credit score was 771. I know this number precisely because it was, in the context of my life and what I had come from and what I was working toward, a number I had tended the way a gardener tends something that took time to grow and requires continued care to maintain. 771 is in the very good range. It would have allowed me to do things I was beginning to plan for, a mortgage, eventually, the first owned space of my adult life. Would have, past tense, because of the $47,000. The call to First Meridian Bank's fraud department was the call that happens in the movie version, and that in the real version is less dramatic and more clinical, and in some ways worse because the clinical version requires you to stay very calm and answer questions very precisely when what you actually want to do is put the phone against the wall and scream. The woman I spoke to, her name was Brittany. She had a patient, measured voice of someone who takes these calls regularly and has learned to be kind within the constraints of the protocol, walked me through the preliminary fraud report process. She asked me to confirm my identity. She asked me to confirm that I had not authorized the loan. She asked me several questions about my recent activities, none of which included anything connected to First Meridian Bank or a $47,000 loan. She said the loan was processed in person at our Westthamer branch, Mr. Okafor. The applicant presented identification and supporting documentation. I said, I have been to the Westthamer area exactly once in the past 2 months. To a restaurant with my colleague. I did not visit any bank. She said, I understand. This will need to be formally investigated. I'm going to need you to come into a branch to file the in-person fraud report. For a loan of this size we require. I said, which branch? She said, any branch will do, but given that the loan was originated at the Westthamer location. I said, I'll go to the Westthamer branch. I did not go immediately. I went to the bathroom of my office, which is a single occupancy with a lock, and I stood at the sink for approximately 4 minutes. Then I went back to my desk. I told my supervisor, a man named Adwale Femi, Nigerian-American himself, 44, a person I trust both professionally and personally, that I had a family emergency and needed to take the afternoon. He looked at me. He has known me for 3 years and he reads people accurately. He said, is it your family or is it an emergency? I said, both. He said, go, call me if you need anything. I drove to the Westthamer branch of First Meridian Bank. But before I tell you what happened in that branch, before I tell you about the folder and the woman and the thing that changed the entire shape of what I understood, I need to tell you what I found out in the 47 minutes between Brittany's call and my walking into that branch. I called my mother. I will tell you exactly what I said and exactly what she said, because I have replayed this conversation enough times that it is exact, the way a record is exact, the way things that matter get memorized by the body without your permission. I said, Mama, I need you to tell me what you know about a loan at First Meridian Bank. Silence. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of someone who has been expecting a call and has arrived at the moment they were expecting and is deciding in real time what to do now that it has come. She said, Who told you about that? I said, I got a credit alert. She said, Tobena. I said, Mama, the loan is in my name. I did not take out a loan. Someone used my name and my information to take out $47,000. I need you to tell me what you know about this. She said, It's complicated. I said, Uncomplicate it. She said, Your father. I said, Tell me. She said, We needed the money. The business, the Utch situation, there were bills and your father's firm had the contract issue, and we needed to bridge the gap and you have good credit, Tobena. You've always had good credit and we thought. I said, You thought what, Mama? She said, We thought it was a family decision. It affects all of us, the family. I said, Mama, listen to me very carefully. You used my name without my knowledge or consent to take out a $47,000 loan. That is not a family decision. That is fraud. The word sat in the phone line between us like something dropped from a great height. She said, Don't say that word. I said, That's the word for what it is. She said, Tobena, you don't understand the pressure we were under. You don't know what the past 6 months. I said, When I come home from the bank I will want a full explanation. Everything, every detail. Right now I am going to the branch to report this, and I need you to understand that I am going to report it because my credit and my financial future are not things that were yours to make decisions about, regardless of what you were facing. She said, Please don't. I said, Mama, I love you, and I am going to the bank. I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot of First Meridian Bank's Westthamer branch, and I was shaking in the way you shake when the adrenaline has nowhere to go. When your body has prepared itself for a threat, and the threat is not something you can run from or fight, it is just a fact sitting in the world requiring a response, and your body is doing the shaking instead of the running because that is all there is to do. I breathed, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Something a therapist taught me at 23 when I was going through a difficult period, the year after graduation when everything felt uncertain and anxiety had become a roommate I hadn't invited. Then I got out of the car and went inside. The Westthamer branch of First Meridian Bank is a mid-sized branch in a strip mall between a Vietnamese restaurant and a nail salon. It has the particular aesthetic of a regional bank branch that was last renovated around 2015, not ugly, not beautiful, functional in the way of a space that exists to process transactions rather than to inspire. There was a line. Of course there was a line. I waited in the line with the granola bar still somewhere in my system, and the phone call with my mother sitting in my chest like a stone, and the credit alert still open on my phone because I kept looking at it, as though I needed to keep confirming that it was real and that I was not overreacting to something that had a different, benign explanation. It was real, it had no different, benign explanation. When I reached the front of the line, I told the teller, young woman, name tag said Kemi *, which is a Yoruba name that caught my attention in the specific way that Nigerian names always catch my attention in American spaces where they are unexpected, that I needed to file a fraud report on a loan opened in my name without my authorization. Her expression shifted immediately from the professional blankness of a bank teller performing routine work to something more careful and attentive. She said, For that, sir, you'll need to speak with a branch manager. One moment. She picked up her phone. She said something I couldn't hear into the receiver. She put it down. She said, Our branch manager will be right with you, if you want to have a seat. I said, I'll stand. She nodded, she understood why. I stood at the side of the teller area and I waited. The Vietnamese restaurant next door was visible through the branch's large front windows, and there were people going in and out of it, and I remember thinking, in the specific dissociated way of someone who is processing something difficult, that all of those people were having an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that the world was conducting itself normally outside this glass, and that I was standing inside it with $47,000 in debt attached to my name, and my parents' voice in my phone saying it's a family decision. The branch manager came from the back. I want to pause here. I want to pause at this specific moment, the moment before I saw her face, the moment between the teller saying our branch manager will be right with you and the door from the back office opening. Because this is the hinge, this is the moment the story turns, and I want you to feel the weight of what came before the hinge so that you understand what the turning meant. I had been shaking in the car. I had been standing at the teller window with the stone in my chest and the alert on my phone. I had called my mother and she had said it's a family decision, and I had used the word fraud and she had said don't say that word, and I had said it is what it is and hung up. I was 28 years old and I had spent 6 years building a financial life that was solid and careful and mine. And in the time it took my parents to walk into a bank branch and present my information, my social security number, my date of birth, probably a copy of my ID that had been in my parents' files from some previous document situation, the various identifying details of a person whose life has been lived in proximity to people who know everything about them. In that time, they had attached a $47,000 liability to my name. I had reported my parents for fraud. I was about to file a formal fraud report against 2 people who had raised me, who had worked to give me a good life, who had fed me and clothed me, and paid for the things that the scholarship didn't cover, and who, somewhere in the past 6 months in a situation I did not yet fully understand, had made a decision that was either desperation or entitlement or both, and that was now sitting in the formal record of a regional bank branch as a loan in my name. I was standing at the edge of something that was going to change my relationship with my parents forever, regardless of how the fraud report went. I understood that. I had understood it in the car in the parking lot, and I had gotten out of the car anyway, because the alternative was to absorb the $47,000 and the credit damage and the violation of my financial autonomy and call it a family matter. And I was not able to do that, because doing that would have made me complicit in the framework that had produced the action. The framework that said my name and my credit and my identity were family resources, available for family decisions. Without my consent, the door from the back office opened. The branch manager came out. She was a Nigerian woman in her mid to late 40s, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, natural hair in a low professional style, the bearing of someone who has been managing a bank branch long enough that the authority of the role has become simply how she carries herself. Her name tag said Ifechai Okonkwo, branch manager. I know that names. Ifechai Okonkwo is my mother's closest friend from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, where they were in the same faculty of business administration in the late 1980s. They had come to Houston within 2 years of each other. They had been in the same church for 20 years. I had called her Auntie Ifechai my entire life. She had attended my high school graduation. She had given me a card when I got my scholarship to Rice that contained $50 and the handwritten note, "Tobena, you are the one who will change things. Do not forget it." She had been at my parents' house for Sunday dinner approximately 40 times that I could count. She was the branch manager of the branch where my parents had taken out a fraudulent loan in my name. She looked at me. I looked at her. The moment lasted approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, several things happened simultaneously in a way that makes them difficult to describe linearly, but that I will try to describe anyway, because the simultaneity is part of what it was. I understood that she knew who I was. I understood that she had known who the loan applicant was. I understood that I did not yet know, and could not yet know from her expression alone, which side of this she was on. And I understood that the next few minutes were going to determine something about my life that was larger than the $47,000, larger than the credit score, larger than even the fraud report. Something about what kind of person I was going to be, and what kind of relationships I was going to have, and what I was willing to let happen to me in the name of family. She said, "Tobena." I said, "Auntie Ifechai." A beat. She said, "Come to my office." Her office was the kind of branch manager's office that is functional rather than decorative: a desk, 2 chairs opposite it, a computer, a printer, a small filing cabinet, A framed photograph on the desk that I could see from where I sat was her family. 2 children. A husband I recognized from church. The ordinary artifacts of a professional life. She sat behind the desk. I sat in one of the chairs. The door was closed. She put her hands flat on the desk. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "How did you find out?" I said, "Credit alert." She said, "When?" I said, "This morning." She said, "You've already called the fraud line." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "And you called your mother?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What did she say?" I said, "She said it was a family decision." I closed her eyes for a moment. Not long, just long enough to be the physical expression of something internal, a wince or a prayer, or the particular internal act of someone who has been dreading this specific moment for a period of time and is now in it. She opened her eyes. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" I said, "That depends on what it is." She said, "I know, I'm asking anyway." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I processed this loan." The room was very quiet. She said, "I was the manager on duty when your parents came in. Your mother came in. Your father was in the car. I don't know why he didn't come in. Maybe he couldn't. Your mother came in with the documentation. She had your social security card, a photocopy but clear. She had your driver's license, also a photocopy. She had your birth certificate. She had a utility bill with your name on it." A pause. She had everything the standard loan application requires. I said, "She had copies of all of that because I'm her son and those documents go back years and..." She said, "I know." I said, "You knew she wasn't me." She said, "I knew she wasn't you." The room was very, very quiet. I said, "Then..." She said, "Let me finish." I waited. She said, "I knew she wasn't you. I also knew your mother. I have known your mother for 32 years. She sat across from me at this desk, not this desk, I was at a different desk. I've been at this branch for 3 years. She sat across from me and she was..." I stopped. Something moved in her face that was difficult to read. She was the most frightened I have ever seen her, and I have known Adana Okafor for 32 years. I said, "What was she afraid of?" She said, "I'll get to that. I need you to understand something about the moment first. Your mother sat across from me and she explained the situation, that you had discussed the loan as a family, that you had agreed to it, that there had been a miscommunication about the paperwork and you couldn't come in yourself but had sent the documentation." She said, I stopped again. She said, "You knew about it." I said, "I didn't know about it." She said, "I know that now, I suspected it then." I said, "You suspected it?" She said, "Yes." I said, "And you processed it anyway?" The word "anyway" sat between us. She did not flinch from it. She met it directly, which I will say for her. She met the thing I was putting in front of her without retreating. She said, "Yes, I processed it anyway, and I have been living with that decision for 6 weeks. And when Kemi told me there was a young man at the window reporting a fraud on a loan and I came out and I saw you," she stopped. "When I saw you, I understood that the thing I had been living with for 6 weeks had arrived at its consequence." I said, "The consequence is that my credit is damaged, and there's $47,000 attached to my name, and my parents committed identity fraud against me, and you helped them." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I didn't know what was going to happen to your family if I didn't." She told me. She told me everything, in the 43 minutes we sat in that office, in the specific way that someone tells you a thing they have been carrying alone, not the organized narrative version, but the real version, which comes out in the order it comes out, because that is how things are stored when they are stored under pressure. The situation my mother had mentioned on the phone was this: my father's younger brother, my uncle Chukwu's, called by everyone, had, for the past 3 years, been in financial trouble of a specific and catastrophic kind. He had borrowed money from my father over the course of those 3 years, in amounts that my mother had not known the full extent of, amounts that she had begun to discover over the previous 8 months as the debts became impossible to conceal. My uncle had borrowed, my parents had given over 3 years, with the expectation of repayment that had not come, approximately $62,000. My father had given it in increments, from savings, from credit cards, from a home equity line of credit that he had taken out without telling my mother the full extent. By the time my mother discovered the scope of it, the home equity line was at its limit. The credit cards were carrying balances that were costing them $300 a month in interest alone. The savings account they had been building for retirement was significantly depleted, and my uncle Utch, who had been borrowing to cover losses from a business that had been failing for 3 years in a way that he had been managing through borrowing rather than confronting, had disappeared. Not literally. He had stopped returning calls. He had not been to church in 4 months. He was, in the terminology that my mother used with Ifchai when she came to the branch that day, handling his own situation now. Which meant the money was gone, and there was no path to getting it back, and the financial situation my parents were actually in was not the solid middle-class stability it appeared to be from the outside, but rather a precarious structure that had been held together by the incremental borrowing and the community-facing performance of normalcy and was now, with my uncle's disappearance and the full reckoning of what my father had given away, genuinely at risk. The loan, the $47,000, was to cover the most immediate debts, the credit card balances that were accruing the most interest, the home equity payment that was coming due, the gap between what they owed right now and what they had available to pay it. My mother had come to Ifchai because Ifchai was the one person she trusted who worked in financial services and who she thought might be able to help. She had come, Ifchai told me, initially to ask for advice, how to handle the debt restructuring, what options existed, whether there was a way to consolidate the various obligations into something more manageable. And in the course of that conversation, which had gone on for a long time, the idea of the loan had emerged. Ifchai said, I told her it wasn't the right approach. I told her there were better options, debt counselling, renegotiating the home equity terms, potentially a personal loan for your parents themselves rather than, she stopped. Rather than this. I said, but she had my information. She said, she had your information because she had asked, months earlier, about co-signing on something. You probably don't remember. She asked you once about whether you'd help them with a financial document, and you said yes to helping with paperwork, and she interpreted that as. I said, that was for a car insurance thing, 3 years ago. I helped with insurance documentation for the second car. She said, I know, she didn't interpret it that way. I said, she interpreted yes to insurance paperwork as permission to use my identity for a $47,000 loan. Ifchai said, I don't think she thought of it in those terms. I think she was in a place where the need was so urgent and the pressure was so complete, and the options felt so limited that she found a way to frame each step as the next small step rather than looking at the full picture of what she was doing. I said, that's very generous. She said, I know. I said, you're giving her the most generous possible interpretation. She said, yes, because I've known her for 32 years, and because I was there when she was at the table crying about what had happened with Utch and what her husband had done and what her family was facing. And I can tell you with complete certainty that the woman who sat across from me was not calculating or malicious. She was desperate and she was out of options, and she was in a framework, the same framework she was raised in, the same one I was raised in, where the resources of the family are the family's resources, and the boundary between her situation and yours was not, in that moment, one she could see clearly. I said, intention doesn't change what happened to me. She said, no, it doesn't. I said, my credit is damaged. She said, yes. I said, there is a $47,000 liability on my record. She said, yes. I said, and you processed the loan that caused this. She said, yes. I said, Auntie Ifchai, I have to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly. She said, ask. I said, is there a version of what you did that is not also fraud? She was quiet for a moment. She said, no. I am going to tell you about what happened next, which is the part that requires the most honesty about myself, because I have not always been able to be fully honest about it, even in the conversations with the people I am closest to. Because what happened next involved me making a choice that I did not expect to make, and that I am still, 2 years later, living with the implications of. But before I tell you that, I need to tell you about the people who carried me through the period between that office and the choice. Because I did not carry myself alone, and a story that presents a person as a solitary figure making solitary decisions in solitary rooms is always an incomplete story. My best friend is a woman named Ezin Uchenna, 30 years old, from Houston like me, daughter of Nigerian immigrants like me, an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Houston. We have been friends since we were 7 years old and met at the Nigerian Cultural Association's children's program, which our mothers both dragged us to on Saturday mornings, with the specific insistence of immigrant parents who want their children to remain connected to a culture that American public school is not going to maintain for them. Ezin has known me for 21 years. She has known my parents for 21 years. She was, when I called her from the parking lot of First Meridian Bank after leaving IFT's office, the first person I called, because she is the first person I call always, in the same way you reach for the most reliable tool when you need a tool. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Ezin, I need to tell you something and I need you to not tell me it's going to be okay." She said, "Go." I told her everything. I told her about the credit alert and the call to the fraud line and the call to my mother and the bank and IFCHI and the office and everything IFCHI had told me. I told it to her in a gas station, parking lot 2 blocks from the First Meridian branch, because I had driven away from the bank without having processed where I was going and had ended up at a gas station, and had stayed there because staying somewhere was better than driving while I was in the state I was in. Ezin was quiet through all of it. She is a specific kind of listener, not the kind who interjects to say, "Oh my God, and I can't believe it," but the kind who takes in the full thing before she speaks, who understands that the value she is providing while you talk is the value of being fully received rather than being reacted to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How are you physically? Are you okay to drive?" I said, "I'm in a parking lot." She said, "Stay there, I'm leaving work." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "Tobena, I'm leaving work, stay where you are." She came. She sat in the passenger seat of my Honda Civic and we talked for an hour and a half. She asked questions, not leading questions, not questions with embedded judgments, but genuine information-gathering questions, the accountant's instinct for getting the full picture before drawing a conclusion. At the end of the hour and a half she said, "Here is what I see as the situation, correct me where I'm wrong." I said, "Go." She said, "Your parents are in genuine financial distress caused partly by your uncle's situation and partly by your father's choices in responding to your uncle's situation. They are facing real consequences, potential loss of the home, significant debt, the end of what their financial life has been. Your mother made a decision, with IFCHI's facilitation, to address that distress by using your identity for a loan. This has damaged your credit, attached a liability to your name, and constitutes identity fraud under Texas law. You have the legal right to pursue this formally, which would likely result in criminal charges for your mother and potentially for IFCHI, and would result in the loan being investigated and potentially reversed with full legal protection of your credit. You also have the option not to pursue it formally, in which case the loan remains on your record unless you pay it or negotiate some other resolution, and the financial damage continues." I said, "Yes, that's the situation." She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Then don't decide yet." I said, "I went there to file a fraud report." She said, "I know you didn't file it." I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I thought about this for a moment. I said, "Because IFCHI told me everything before I could." She said, "Is that the only reason?" I said, "No." She said, "What's the other reason?" I said, "Because I saw my mother in IFCHI's description of her. I saw my mother crying at that desk, and I saw the situation clearly for the first time, not just what she did but what she was in when she did it, and I couldn't." I stopped. I couldn't finish the motion that I came there to make. Ezin said, "That's love." I said, "It might also be weakness." She said, "Those aren't always different." She put her hand on my arm for a moment, not a hug, not a production, just a hand on an arm, the specific physical language of someone who is with you. She said, "Go home, sleep. We will figure out the next step tomorrow." I went home. I did not sleep. I lay in my apartment in Montrose with the credit alert still on my phone and my mother's voice in my head, saying it's a family decision, and IFCHI's voice saying I processed it anyway, and Ezin's voice saying that's love, and all of it competing for the space that sleep was supposed to occupy. At 3 in the morning I called my father. My father and I have a complicated relationship that I have not fully described, because the full description would require more than the space I have here. The short version is this: my father is a man whose love is completely real and completely present, and expressed almost entirely through action rather than language. He shows up. He fixes things. He builds things literally with his hands, in the way of a civil engineer who has never lost the hands-on instinct of someone who came up learning to read a site before a blueprint. He has driven 4 hours to help me move an apartment's worth of furniture. He has reviewed every lease I have ever signed and identified the clauses I needed to negotiate. He has shown me, through 35 years of consistent action, that I matter to him in a way that is real and structural. He has never once told me he loves me in words. This is not the devastating confession it might sound like, because I have known for a long time that the words are not the vessel he uses for that particular cargo, and I have made peace with receiving what he gives in the form he gives it, and understanding what it means. What I had not made peace with, what became, in the context of the $47,000, newly painful, was the understanding that a man whose love is expressed through action had, in a situation of crisis, taken an action that had harmed me. And the harm of it was, in part, because of the gap between his version of love and the kind of love that protects rather than uses. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Tobena." I said, "Papa." Silence. He said, "Your mother called me." I said, "I know." He said, "She told me you went to the bank." I said, "I went to the bank." He said, "Did you?" I said, "I didn't file the report, not yet." He exhaled, the specific exhale of someone who has been holding something they needed to release. I said, "Papa, tell me what happened, from the beginning, not Mama's version, not what you told Mama, the full version." He said, "It's very late." I said, "I know." He said, "I haven't slept properly in 2 months." I said, "I know that feeling, tell me." And he told me, my father at 3 a.m, in the specific voice of a man who is carrying something that has become too heavy, told me what had happened with his brother Uch. He told me in the specific linguistic register of a Nigerian man talking to his adult son about shame. Not quite direct, not quite indirect. The way of a person who is moving through something they find very difficult to name directly, but who is determined to name it anyway, because the alternative is to let it remain unnamed, and he has understood that the unnamed thing has become dangerous. Uch had been running a small import business. Medical equipment, he had told my father, surgical supplies, devices, things he was importing from China and selling to hospitals and clinics in Nigeria. He had been building this business for 5 years, he had said. He needed capital for the next expansion phase, he had said. He would repay everything within 18 months, he had said. My father had believed him. Not because my father is naive, he is not, he is an intelligent and experienced man, but because Uch is his brother, the younger brother he had helped raise after their father died when my father was 17 and Uch was 12, the brother whose school fees he had contributed to while building his own career, the brother whose wedding he had partially funded, whose first apartment deposit he had covered, whose life he had been supporting in increments for 30 years in the specific way of an eldest son who has absorbed the responsibility of family survival as a structural feature of his identity. He had believed him because wanting to believe the people you love is not stupidity. It is the particular vulnerability that love creates, and it is the vulnerability that people who love you, or who know you love them, can use, deliberately or not, to gain access to things they have no right to. The business was not what Uch had described. The medical equipment import was partially real and largely fraudulent. He had been importing some legitimate supplies and using the appearance of a legitimate business to cover significant financial losses from other activities, debts from a previous failed venture that he had been managing through the medical equipment business's credit. The 18-month repayment plan had been optimistic at best and deliberately misleading at worst, and by the time my father understood the scope of what he had lent and the slim probability of repayment, the amounts had grown to the point where acknowledging them to my mother required acknowledging the full scope of what he had done. He had not told my mother for 8 months. He had been managing it, making minimum payments on the home equity line, covering the credit card interest, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, while trying to find a resolution that didn't require the full disclosure of what he had done. My mother had found out when a credit card statement arrived at the house, a card she had not known existed, opened in both their names by my father to fund one of the transfers, and the balance was $26,000. The confrontation between my parents after that discovery was something my father described in the careful language of a man who is not going to tell me everything about his marriage but who is telling me enough. He said it was very difficult. He said your mother was right to be angry. He said what happened next, the loan, the visit to Ifchai, the use of my name was not his idea but that he knew about it and did not stop it, which made him responsible. He said, I did not stop it because I was I could not find another way out, and I told myself it was temporary, that we would repay it, that you would understand when we explained that family. I said, Papa, stop. He stopped. I said, I need you to hear something. He said, I'm listening. I said, you taught me that you don't build on an unstable foundation. You told me that when I was 11 years old and you were explaining why the building that collapsed in Abuja collapsed. You said, someone built on something that couldn't hold the weight, and that's what you did. You built a secret on top of a secret on top of a secret, and when it couldn't hold the weight, you used my name to try to shore up the foundation, and you did it without asking me, without telling me, without giving me the choice that was mine to make. He was quiet. I said, you did to me what Uch did to you. You used the credit of someone who trusted you to cover a gap that the trust was not meant to cover. The silence on the phone was the longest silence I have ever shared with my father. Then he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very different from his usual voice, quieter, less certain, the voice of a man who has been reduced to something more essential by what he is hearing and recognizing as true. Yes. Just that. Yes. I said, okay. He said, what will you do? I said, I don't know yet, I'm going to sleep. We are going to have a full conversation when I have slept and thought, and you and Mama are going to tell me everything, the full picture, the full amount, the full situation, and then we are going to figure out what is possible. He said, Tobena. I said, yes. He said, I am. He stopped. The word he was looking for was one I had never heard him reach for. I waited. He said, I am sorry. I know that is insufficient. I know it does not. I said, it's a start. He said, yes. I said, good night, Papa. He said, good night, my son. I am going to tell you about Ifchai now. Not the Ifchai of the office and the fraud and the processed loan. The fuller Ifchai, the one whose presence in this story is more complicated and more important than the role of accomplice, which is the easy framing. She called me the morning after my conversation with my father. 7:45, which meant she had been awake early, which meant she had also not slept well. I answered. She said, I want to tell you something I didn't tell you yesterday. I said, go ahead. She said, when your mother came to me, before the loan conversation, before any of that, she came to me as a friend. She came to me because I was the one person she could tell and she needed to tell someone. She had been carrying this for months alone and she was, Tobena, I have seen your mother at church every Sunday for 20 years. I have seen her at your graduations and your uncle's funeral and every significant event in your family's life. I have never seen her the way she was when she walked into this branch. I said, what do you mean? She said she had lost weight, significantly. In the time since I had seen her at Easter, maybe 5 months, she had lost weight that was visible. Her hands were not steady. She was not sleeping, I could see that. She was frightened in a way that went very deep, the way that people are frightened when they have been afraid for a long time without relief. I sat with that. She said, I'm not telling you this to excuse what happened. I'm telling you because when you think about what to do next, I want you to have the full picture of what your mother was in, not just what she did. I said, Auntie Ifchai, I need to ask you something directly. She said, ask. I said, when you processed that loan, you knew it was wrong. You knew it constituted fraud. You have worked in banking for how long? She said, 21 years. I said, 21 years, you know the regulations, you know the consequences, you processed it anyway. Why? She was quiet for a moment. She said, because I was afraid she was going to do something worse. I said, what do you mean? She said, when she came to me, when we had the conversation and I saw how bad the situation was, I was watching her and I was thinking about what a person does when they have no options and enormous pressure, and when the fear has been there for long enough that it starts to affect judgment in serious ways. I was thinking about what she might do if I turned her away. And I processed the loan because I told myself it was the least harmful of the things she might do if I said no. I said, "That's a rationalization." She said, "Yes, it is, I know that." I said, "You made yourself responsible for my credit by assuming my mother would do something worse. You didn't ask me. You didn't call me. You could have called me, you have my number, you've had my number since I was a teenager, and told me what was happening and asked me what I wanted to do. You chose not to." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because calling you meant the situation became something it couldn't be made smaller again. If I called you, it was real and formal and the damage was visible. If I processed the loan, I told myself it could still be managed quietly. They would repay it, you would never know, or you would know and it would be explained, and it would be a family matter that stayed inside the family." I said, "You chose the version where I didn't know what was happening to me." She said, "Yes." I said, "In the name of protecting my mother." She said, "And you, I told myself also you." I said, "Auntie Ifchai, I know you have known me since I was 7 years old. I know you have cared about my family. I know that what you did came from a place that was not simply self-interested or malicious. But you need to understand that choosing the version where I didn't know, choosing the version where the person whose life was being affected was kept out of the conversation, that is the same choice my parents made. It is the choice that says, this person's autonomy is less important than our ability to manage the situation without complication, and I am not able to accept that framing from my parents or from you." A long silence. She said, "You're right." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to figure out what is right, for myself, not for the family narrative, not for the community perception, for me and for what I can live with and for what makes my actual life better rather than more complicated." She said, "Whatever you decide, if there is anything I can do from my position to make the credit situation easier to resolve." I said, "I'll be in touch about that." She said, "Tobena, I want you to know, irrespective of all of this, that what I said in that card when you got your scholarship was true. You are the one who changes things. I believed that then and I believe it now." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know. There is a man who matters in this story who I have not yet introduced, and he matters in the way that people who appear briefly sometimes matter enormously, not as a large presence but as a precise one, as the person who says the thing that reorganizes everything. His name is Mr. Celestine Ibarra, the teacher I mentioned at the beginning, the one who looked at my portfolio when I was 17 and said, 'This is what you are, do this.' He is 61 now. He retired from teaching 4 years ago. He still lives in Houston in the Mayland neighborhood, in a house full of art that he has made and collected over 40 years. He was the person I called after Ezin, after my father, after Ifchai. He was the third call made on the second day, when I had slept 4 hours and woken up with the situation no clearer, but myself slightly more able to think. He picked up immediately and said, "Tobena, it has been too long, tell me what's happening." I told him. He listened without interrupting. He has the quality of a good teacher, which is that he was trained to receive information fully before responding. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does your gut say?" I said, "My gut is confused." He said, "No, it isn't. Your gut is saying something, your head is confused, your gut is clear. What does it say?" I thought about it. I said, "My gut says that my parents made a terrible decision, and that Ifchai made a terrible decision, and that both of those decisions came from places of real pressure and real love and real fear, and that filing a criminal fraud report will destroy things that can be rebuilt differently, but cannot be rebuilt at all if I pursue the formal path." He said, "And your head?" I said, "My head says they violated my rights. My head says $47,000 is not a small thing. My head says that the precedent of accepting this is a precedent that says, my identity is available for family use, and I cannot set that precedent." He said, "Those both sound right." I said, "They can't both be right." He said, "Of course they can. The question is not which one is right. The question is which right thing you can live with." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There is the right thing for the formal system. There is the right thing for your family. There is the right thing for your own future. These are 3 different rights and they may point in 3 different directions, and the question is which direction you can walk in and still be recognizably yourself. I said, that doesn't narrow it down. He said, no, it's not supposed to. It's supposed to be accurate. I said, Mr. Ibarra, if you were me. He said, I'm not you. I can't be you in this situation. What I can tell you is that in my experience, 40 years of it, the people who pursue formal justice against their families and win are often right and often also lonely for a very long time afterward. And the people who find another path are often imperfect in their resolution and sometimes wrong and often find something that works better. I am not recommending the second path. I am saying it exists, and it is a real path walked by real people. I said, what would the second path look like? He said, it would look like a very hard conversation, multiple hard conversations. Legal agreements, yes, I mean put it in writing, protect yourself in writing even when you're choosing not to pursue criminal charges. Financial accountability from your parents that is documented and real, possibly professional financial intervention, and a fundamental renegotiation of what the relationship between you and your family looks like going forward. I said, can that be done? He said, can you do it? Yes, whether your parents can is the question you don't yet know the answer to. I drove to my parents' house 3 days after the bank visit. I had prepared for this the way I prepare for the things I need to get right, carefully, completely, with documentation. Ezin, who is an accountant and who had spent 2 days doing the financial forensics on what I now knew of my parents' situation, had helped me build a clear picture: the full debt, the available assets, the options for restructuring, the realistic path to solvency if things were handled correctly. I had spoken by phone with a consumer protection attorney named Dara Obi, a Nigerian-American woman in Houston, referred to me by a colleague at the architecture firm, who had explained my legal options in precise terms without pushing me toward any of them, and who had said, if you choose the non-criminal path, I can help you structure an agreement that gives you legal protection without prosecution. It's your choice. Both paths have legal validity. I had called Ifchai once more the night before I went to my parents. I asked her to meet me at the house. She said she would. When I arrived, my parents were in the living room of the house on Willowbend Boulevard, where I had grown up. Where the furniture had been rearranged once since I was a child, but where the photograph of my parents' wedding still hung above the television, and the books my mother had collected over 30 years still lined the wall, and the specific smell of the house, cooking oil and my mother's lotion, and something that is just the smell of the house, irreducible, was as present as it had always been. Ifchai arrived 5 minutes after me. She sat in the armchair near the window, which was the chair I had always thought of as a guest chair, and she was wearing the same charcoal blazer she had worn at the bank, which made me think she had come directly from work or had dressed the same way deliberately, as a signal that she was here in the capacity that she owed something to rather than as the auntie she had been to me for 21 years. My father was in his usual chair. My mother was on the sofa. I stood for a moment, then took the chair across from my father, which put me at the center of the room in a way that was not accidental. I said, I'm going to say some things and then I'm going to ask some things. I need everyone in this room to let me finish before anyone responds. Can everyone agree to that? My mother said, yes. My father said, yes. Ifchai nodded. I said, what happened is not going to be erased or minimized or reframed in this room. A loan was taken out in my name without my knowledge or consent. My credit was damaged. My financial future was affected without my participation. That is the fact of it, and any conversation we have today that does not start from that fact as its foundation is a conversation I'm not going to participate in. No one spoke. I said, I have made the decision not to pursue criminal charges. I want to be clear about why. Not because what happened was acceptable. Not because I think the framework that produced it, the framework that says family resources are communal and can be used without individual consent, is correct. Because I have looked at my family and I have decided that criminal charges would destroy things that I am not yet ready to destroy. That is my decision, and it belongs to me, and I am making it from my own values, not from family pressure or community expectations. I said, in exchange for not pursuing criminal charges, I have 3 requirements, non-negotiable. Each one has to be agreed to before we leave this room, and each one is going to be documented in writing. I said, first, the loan goes on my parents' financial responsibility, not as a loan they're doing me a favor by repaying, as a debt they owe me, documented in a legal agreement that I will have drawn up by my attorney. They will repay it on a schedule that is realistic and that accounts for their actual financial situation, which we are going to go through fully and honestly right now, in this room, with all the documents, and the repayment will be tracked, and if it stops, I reserve the right to reopen the legal question. I said, second, my parents will engage with a financial counselor, not a community member, not a family friend, a certified professional who has no relationship with our family and no stake in the community narrative. This counselor will help them address the underlying situation, the debts, the money, the home equity situation, in a way that is sustainable. I am not going to watch them manage a crisis by accumulating more hidden obligations. I said, third, we are going to have a different relationship going forward, not a punitive different, not distant, not cold, but honest. My parents are going to tell me when things are hard, not after they've taken a drastic step, not when the situation has become a crisis, when things are hard. And in exchange, I am going to be a genuine resource, not a financial resource to be drawn on without asking, but a person who can help think through problems and access options that may not be visible from inside the pressure. I said, those are my terms. If everyone in this room agrees to those terms, we can begin working on the details right now. If anyone does not agree, I will be calling my attorney this evening. The room was quiet. My mother was crying. Not loudly, silently, the way she cries when she has tried very hard not to and the effort has failed. Tears on her face, her hands folded in her lap, her posture very straight. My father was looking at his hands. Ifchai was looking at me with an expression that I read as a combination of recognition and something else, something that took me a moment to identify, and that I finally identified as. She was seeing something she had not expected to see, and what she was seeing was the thing she had written in a card when I was 18. You are the one who changes things. My father said, I agree. My mother said, I agree. Ifchai said, I want to say something. I looked at her. She said, I want to say that my role in this is separate from your parents' role. I processed that loan. I had the authority and the responsibility to refuse it and I didn't. That is a thing that has to be addressed not just between us but with my institution. I have been trying to figure out how to address it and I want you to know that I intend to address it. Whatever that costs me professionally, that is the cost of what I chose to do. I said, what does addressing it mean specifically? She said, it means I am going to disclose to my branch compliance officer that the loan application had irregularities that I overlooked and that a formal review is needed. It means the loan will be formally flagged. It means the terms may be renegotiated in a way that reflects the actual situation. It means I may face consequences from the bank that are significant. I said, you might lose your job. She said, yes. I said, you're prepared for that. She said, I'm not prepared for it. I'm going to do it anyway. Because the alternative is to let this sit in a bank record uncorrected, which means the system that is supposed to prevent this kind of thing has a gap in it that I put there, and I am not able to live with that. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, Auntie Ifchai, I need you to understand that what you did was genuinely harmful, and that I am not going to tell you it was okay. But I also want you to know that what you just said it's honest. It's the most honest thing anyone has said in this room about their own responsibility. She said, I've had 3 days to think about what honesty costs. I said, so have I. The financial counselor's name was Dr. Blessing Argu. She was referred to me by Dara Obi, the attorney, and she was extraordinary in the specific way of a person who has seen many versions of the situation she is walking into, and who brings to it neither surprise nor judgment, just competence and the ability to hold a clear view of something complex without flinching. She met with my parents 6 times over 8 weeks. I was present for the first meeting and the first to establish the parameters and the honest accounting of the full situation, the last to hear her assessment and the plan she had developed. The full picture was this: my parents' combined debt, including the home equity line, the credit cards, the loan in my name, and 2 smaller obligations they had not mentioned, was approximately $81,000. Their assets included the house, which had equity, substantial equity, because they had been paying the mortgage for 22 years, and their retirement accounts, which were reduced but not emptied. Dr. Argu's plan involved a home equity loan, a legitimate one, in my parents' own names, structured properly, to consolidate the high-interest debt, combined with a realistic monthly budget and a 5-year repayment timeline. The loan in my name was folded into the agreement I had drawn up with Dara, with a monthly payment from my parents to me that was documented and trackable. My parents did not lose the house. I want to tell you that specifically because it is one of the things I am most grateful for in how this resolved, not for my sake but for theirs. The house on Willowbend Boulevard is 23 years of their life in America. It is the place where I grew up and where my siblings grew up and where my mother's books are and where my father's tools are in the garage. Keeping it was possible. It required honesty and Dr. Argu and Dara and Ezin and Mr. Ibarra, and the choice I made in my parents' living room, and it was possible. Ifchai did disclose to her compliance department. She was placed on administrative leave during the investigation. After 3 months, she was given a formal reprimand and required to complete additional training. She was not fired. I found this out because she called me to tell me directly, which I appreciated. She said, "I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." I said, "Thank you." She said, "How is your family?" I said, "Working on it." She said, "Good." My credit score after the loan was formally flagged and the investigation resolved was corrected. It went down during the investigation period and came back up. It is currently 748, not 771, not yet. Give it a year. I need to tell you about my Uncle Utch, because this is the part of the story that has the unexpected turn that changes everything, and I have been building toward it without telling you it was coming, because it came to me without warning and I want you to have it the same way. 6 months after the living room conversation, 5 months into the repayment schedule, 3 months after Dr. Argu's final meeting with my parents, my Uncle Utch called my father. He had not been in contact for 8 months. He had not called, not responded to calls, had been as absent from my father's life as a person can be while still being technically alive and in the same country. He called because he was sick. He had been diagnosed 2 months earlier with a cardiac condition, not immediately life-threatening but serious, requiring treatment, requiring someone. He had been managing it alone in the way that people manage things alone when they have cut themselves off from everyone who would help them, which is to say badly and at great cost to himself. My father told me this on the phone. He told it in the voice he uses when he is telling me something that is hurting him more than he is showing, the specific vocal quality I have learned to read over 28 years. He said he is in Houston. He has been in Houston for 3 months. He didn't, my father stopped. He didn't come to us because he didn't think he deserved to. I was quiet for a moment. I said, "What does he need?" My father said, He needs help getting to appointments. He needs someone to know. He's been alone with this." I said, "Papa." He said, I know he. I said, "Papa, you know what you need to do." He said, "Yes." I said, "Do it." He said, "After everything I said, "I know, do it anyway." He did. He went to his brother. Not because the money was recovered. It wasn't, most of it will never be, and not because what Utch had done was forgivable in any simple sense, but because Utch was sick and alone, and because my father is a man whose love expresses itself through action, and his brother needed an action. I drove to the hospital with my father the first time he went to see Utch. I want to be honest about why, not because I had forgiven the cascade of events that Utch's actions had set in motion, but because I had spent 8 months watching what it costs a family when someone disappears from it rather than facing what they've done, and I did not want to be the one who disappeared. I sat in the waiting room while my father went in. They talked for 2 hours. I read a book, or tried to, the way you try to read when your mind is elsewhere, and I thought about the strange shape of what a year had become. The credit alert and the bank and Ifchai's office and the living room and Dr. Argu and Dara and Ezin, and now a hospital waiting room. My father came out. He sat next to me. He said, "He asked about you." I said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him you were the one who found a path through." I said, "I didn't do it alone." He said, "No, but you set the direction." We sat in the waiting room together, my father and I, in the particular quiet of a hospital, which is the quiet of a place where people are dealing with things larger than ordinary life requires. He said, "Tobena." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know I don't say." He stopped, started again. I know I don't say things the way your mother says things, the way some fathers. I said, Papa, I know. He said, I want you to know that I know what you did, what it cost you and what you chose anyway. I want you to know that I know. I looked at him, my father, 61 years old, civil engineer, builder of things, the man who taught me that structures have to be load-bearing or they are decoration, and who had, in a moment of enormous pressure, used me as load-bearing material without my consent, and who was now sitting next to me in a hospital waiting room and telling me that he knew. I said, I know you know. He said, is that sufficient? I said, it's a start. He nodded, the same nod I have known my whole life, the nod that is the vessel for what he cannot say in words. I nodded back. My name is Tobina Okafor. I am 28 years old. My parents used my name to take out a $47,000 loan and called it a family decision. The bank manager who processed the fraud report turned out to be my mother's closest friend of 32 years, who had facilitated the loan in the first place, who sat across a desk from me and told me every true thing she knew, and then spent 3 months accounting for what she had done. I did not pursue criminal charges. I am not going to tell you that was the right decision, because I don't know if there is a universal right decision in a situation like this. I am going to tell you it was my decision, made from my values after full information, with the help of people who were honest with me, even when honesty was uncomfortable. I am going to tell you what I know now that I did not know before this year. I know that love is not permission. I know that the depth of someone's need does not grant them rights over your resources that they did not have before the need arrived. I know that the framework, the family as collective resource framework, the one that says what is mine is yours without individual consent, is a framework that can produce genuine care and genuine harm simultaneously, and that the harm does not cancel the care, but neither does the care justify the harm. I know that the people who hurt you and the people who love you are sometimes the same people, and that this is not a paradox to be resolved, but a complexity to be navigated. I know that accountability looks like, I did this, it was wrong, here is what I am doing about it, not just one of those 3 things, all 3. I know that Ezin Uchina is the kind of friend that you spend a whole life being grateful for, and that I intend to spend a whole life being that kind of friend to her. I know that Mr. Celestine Ibarra was right when he told me at 17 that this was what I was. He was not just talking about architecture. He was talking about the thing underneath architecture, the belief that how you build the space determines what is possible inside it, and that building honestly is the only way to build something that holds. I know that my credit score is 748 and will be higher by next year. I know that my Uncle Utch is in cardiac rehabilitation and that my father drives him to appointments on Thursdays, and that last month, for the first time, my mother invited him to Sunday dinner, and that he came. I know that Ifechai Okonkwo still works at First Meridian Bank. I know this because she called me 6 months after everything to tell me she had been asked to lead a training on fraud prevention protocols for the Houston branches, and that she intended to use the experience, anonymized, carefully, without identifying anyone, as a case study in how systems fail when personal relationships override institutional responsibility. She asked if I was comfortable with that. I said yes. She said thank you. I said, use it well. She said, I intend to. I know that my parents' repayment schedule is on track. I know this because Dara Obi's legal agreement requires quarterly statements, and I receive them, and I read them, and I file them. I know that my parents call me differently now. Not differently in the surface way, the calls happen at the same times. My mother still asks if I'm eating and my father still asks about the projects I'm working on. Differently in the way that calls feel when the distance between the call and the reality has been collapsed. When what I hear on the phone is the actual situation rather than the managed presentation of the situation. My mother said to me last month, the furnace made a sound, a bad sound. I don't know how serious it is, but I'm telling you before it becomes something bigger. She said it because we had agreed she would. She said it because something had been renegotiated between us about what the relationship looks like. Not the love was always there, but the form of it, the daily practice of it. I said, send me a video of the sound, I'll figure out what it is. She sent the video. It was a minor issue. I called a repairman I knew. He fixed it for a reasonable price. My mother sent me a text that said, thank you, you didn't have to. I sent back, I know. That's why I did. That is the whole shape of it. Not clean, not resolved in the way that things resolve in the versions where there is a neat ending and everyone has learned their lesson and the future is uncomplicated, but true, and moving forward, and built on ground that is load-bearing now in a way it wasn't before, built on honesty, which is the only foundation that actually holds. There is one more thing. The credit alert that started all of this, the notification that came through at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was eating a granola bar and reading a project brief. I have a screenshot of it saved on my phone. Not to look at it, not as a reminder of what happened. I saved it because it is the moment the invisible became visible, and I have learned in the year since to value the moments when invisible things become visible. They are costly moments. They are also the moments when you have the information you need to make real decisions rather than managed ones. I look at the screenshot sometimes, not often, once a month maybe. I look at it and I think about what I built in the year after it arrived, not the financial resolution, though that matters. The other things, the conversations, the agreements, the understanding of what I will accept and what I won't. The relationship with my parents that is different now in the way that honest things are different from managed things, which is to say, harder and realer and capable of holding more weight. I think about Ifchai sitting across from me and telling the truth when she could have managed me. I think about my father in the hospital waiting room saying, "I know what you did." I think about my mother calling about a furnace sound because we had agreed she would. I think about all of it and I think, this is what it looks like when something breaks and the people involved decide to build something better from the pieces. Not something perfect, something better. That is what I have. That is what I chose. That is what, every morning when I look at the 748 on my credit monitoring app and watch it moving slowly back toward where it was, I am grateful for. The number will get there, the ground is holding. That is enough. For anyone who has ever received information about their own life that they did not ask for and did not want, and had to decide in real time what kind of person they were going to be with it, the deciding is the work. The deciding is always the work. You can do it.